Vienna, 1906, just as the gas lamps flickered to life along the Ringstrasse and the bells of St. Stephen's Cathedral tolled 6. Zosia Penley didn't look up as the carriages rolled past the tailor's shop window, their wheels hissing through the slush. She had 1 hour to finish the beaded hem on the Empress's new ball gown, and her fingers were shaking again. Not from the cold. From the hunger. Zosia, barked Frau Berger, bustling in with her usual flurry of starch and scorn, the pearls on the third panel are uneven. Do it again. Zosia didn't argue. She never did. She only nodded, took the panel, and bent over her needle once more. Her braids slipped forward over her shoulder, catching a stray sequin. The other girls whispered behind her, as always, the orphan, the charity case, the one who lived in the attic above the shop and never spoke unless spoken to. She finished the panel just before the clock struck 7. As she reached for the next spool of thread, the front door opened with a gust of wind and a flurry of snow. The man who stepped in didn't belong here. Not with his navy coat trimmed in sable, nor his leather gloves still dusted with frost, nor the gold pin gleaming on his collar an eagle with 2 heads. Frau Berger straightened. "Your Majesty," she stammered, nearly knocking over a mannequin. Zosia froze. He was younger than she expected. Barely 30, with dark hair swept back from a high forehead and eyes that missed nothing. He took off his gloves slowly, his gaze sweeping the room until it landed on her. Her thread tangled. She looked down too late. "I was told my mother's gown would be ready tonight," the man said. His voice was smooth, clipped. He had the kind of authority that didn't ask twice. "Of course, Your Majesty," Frau Berger said, fluttering toward the back. "It's just being." "Who is she?" the Emperor asked, pointing to Zosia. Frau Berger hesitated. "A junior seamstress, Your Majesty. She handles embellishments." "She stitched the train?" "Yes. But the design is mine." He walked toward Zosia. She kept her hands on the fabric, her head low, aware of every heartbeat. "What's your name?" he asked. She swallowed. "Zosia Penley, sir." "Look at me." She did. Slowly. His gaze didn't flinch. "You have a steady hand," he said. "Too steady for a girl your age." "I've had practice." He said nothing for a moment. Then, to Frau Berger, "Bring the gown. I want to see her work." Zosia remained still as the gown was brought forward, ivory silk and thousands of hand-sewn pearls. The Emperor examined the hem, then the embroidery along the bodice. He traced one edge of the beading with a gloved finger. Then he looked at Zosia again. "You did this." She nodded. "Good." He turned. "Have it delivered to the Hofburg by morning." Frau Berger exhaled. "Of course, Your Majesty." He paused at the door. "Zosia Penley," he said. "You'll accompany the gown and make adjustments if needed." Zosia's breath caught. "I am not permitted in the Hofburg, sir." "You are now." And then he was gone, into the snow. She barely slept that night. When dawn broke, Zosia dressed in her plainest blouse, pulled her coat tight, and carried the dress box through the palace gates under the eyes of guards who looked puzzled to see her. Inside, the Hofburg was warm and golden, all marble and mirrors and footsteps echoing endlessly down polished halls. A tall man in uniform met her at the entrance and led her past chambermaids and footmen until they reached a salon filled with morning light. And there he was again. Alone, this time. Standing by the window, holding a letter. "Your Majesty," she said, curtsying low. He looked up. "Zosia," he said, as if testing her name again. "Come here." She placed the box on the table and opened it. He didn't look at the gown. "You're not Viennese," he said. "No, sir." "Where from?" "Galicia. My parents died in the cholera outbreak. I was sent here to work." "How old are you?" 20. He nodded. "Do you know who I am?" "Yes." "Say it." She met his eyes. Emperor Viktor of Austria-Hungary. A flicker of something passed through his expression. Surprise? Amusement? She couldn't tell. I'm to marry a Bavarian princess next spring, he said. She said nothing. But I'm tired of things sewn too tightly to breathe. Still, she said nothing. He stepped closer. Did you mean for the pattern on the hem to resemble a stag's antlers? Her heart jumped. Yes. A Galician symbol. Yes. Bold. I didn't think anyone would notice. He smiled for the first time. It changed his entire face. I noticed. She looked down, pulse racing. He reached out. His glove brushed her wrist, just briefly. Her fingers curled to hide the tremble. Then a knock at the door broke the moment. Later, he said softly. Come back tomorrow. I'll find a reason. She came the next day. And the next. Always with a fabric swatch, a thread sample, a reason to adjust this seam or rework that pleat. He never called her out for the pretense. He only waited until the others left the room before speaking. They spoke of small things first. Her threads. His hunting dogs. The way the snow softened the palace gardens. Then the larger things. His loneliness. Her hunger. The Bavarian princess he'd never met. The attic that still leaked in winter. He never touched her again. Not at first. But once, she handed him a folded length of lace. His hand closed over hers. Neither of them moved. Then, one evening, he handed her a sealed envelope. Take this, he said. Hide it. Read it when you're alone. She did. That night, under her thin blanket, she opened it. Zosia. If I could choose freely, I would choose you. If I must rule, I would not do it alone. Tell me there is a way. V. She pressed the paper to her chest. The next morning, Viktor was gone. No one would say where. Rumors of unrest in Hungary. A duel at dawn in Budapest. A rider with a broken arm and a pistol still smoking. But nothing certain. Zosia waited. 3 days later, a soldier came to the shop with a message. A summons to the Hofburg. Tonight. She went. He was waiting in the garden, coatless in the snow. There's no Bavarian princess, he said. It was a bluff. My counsel wanted leverage. Her breath caught. And the duel? Real. But not mine. I challenged the man who forged the marriage contract. He backed down. Then what happens now? That depends on you. She couldn't speak. I want you, he said. Publicly. Permanently. I'll name you court seamstress. That gets you inside. Then we wait. A few months. I push the council. I win them. And when the time's right. You'll marry me. He stepped closer. If you'll have me. She reached for his hand. No gloves now. Just skin on skin, warm in the cold. I will. The frost had thickened on the palace glass by the time Zosia entered through the side corridor, lantern light glinting against the marble like the inside of a pearl. A valet led her past the tapestry room and into a narrow vestibule where the scent of beeswax and old vellum lingered. She hadn't seen this part of the Hofburg before. There were no gilt cornices here, no frescoed ceilings, just the hush of officials who read by candlelight and the scratch of pens on paper. She waited beside a carved doorway flanked by 2 guards with halberds. One of them, younger than the other, glanced at her plain wool cloak with something like curiosity. She kept her hands folded. Her fingers were chapped again. She'd forgotten her gloves. The door opened inward without warning. Come in, said Viktor. She stepped inside. He wore no sash today, no medals. Only a dark waistcoat and shirt sleeves with the cuffs rolled back. The desk behind him was cluttered with maps and a half-open dossier bearing the wax seal of the imperial chancellery. "Sit," he said, gesturing to the upholstered bench near the hearth. "We won't be disturbed." She lowered herself carefully. The room was warmer than she expected. "I've spoken to Archduke Ferdinand," he said without looking at her. "He's not pleased, but he's practical. He knows I'll need the loyalty of the common provinces when the next budgetary session opens." "Which means what, exactly?" Zosia asked, her voice quieter than she'd intended. "That if I marry someone from outside the noble houses, he'll grumble but he won't block it." She looked at the fire. The flames cast gold light along the hem of her skirt. "I've also secured you chambers in the wing above the court musicians' hall. Discreet. Dry. A fire every night. You'll be listed as upholsterer to the Empress." Zosia's eyes flicked upward. "Isn't that dishonest?" "It's what keeps you safe. And near." He crossed to her, standing just far enough that his shadow didn't touch hers. His gaze swept over her face with quiet intensity. "I've known diplomacy since I could walk. At 6, I was taught how to smile while being insulted in French. But with you," he exhaled. "I find I'd rather be understood than obeyed." She folded her hands tighter. "Then understand this, I don't want to be hidden." "You won't be," he said. "Not forever. But for now, I need time. Time to make the court forget their objections by degrees. To let them grow used to your presence." She nodded slowly. "I've arranged for you to dine with the Empress Dowager next week," he added. Zosia's spine straightened. "Why?" she asked. She saw the gown. "And?" She said the hem reminded her of her father's hunting lodge in Tarnow. "She wants to see the girl who remembered something she hadn't in 30 years. Zosia stared at the coals. "What if I say something wrong? Then I'll say something worse and make yours seem charming by comparison." She smiled, just faintly, and the tension in her shoulders eased. He knelt beside her then, unfastening a velvet pouch from his belt. He didn't open it, just placed it on her lap. Inside, she found a brooch, shaped like a sprig of pine carved in jet and mother of pearl. A Galician mourning emblem. A symbol of perseverance. "It belonged to your mother," he said. Her breath caught. "How?" "I sent word to Tarnow. There's a woman there who remembered your family. She kept it safe after the burial." Zosia turned the brooch over in her palm. The clasp had been mended once, carefully. It was heavier than it looked. "I thought everything was lost," she whispered. "Not everything." She looked up. There was distance between them, yes, but not for long. He stood and extended his hand. "There's a rehearsal tonight. For the 12th night concert. Come. Listen with me." She hesitated. "Won't people wonder? They'll assume you're evaluating the acoustics. For upholstery." He winked. "Just once." She took his hand. No gloves this time, for either of them. The corridors beyond were quiet, and the sound of strings tuning in the distance echoed like a promise. They walked side by side. Not as monarch and subject, but as two people beginning a life they hadn't dared name aloud yet. The music had long faded, but Zosia could still feel the vibration of the cello beneath the floorboards as she stepped into the corridor behind the musicians' gallery. Her breath steamed faintly in the cold, unheated passage, and her palms still bore the faint pressure of the brocade-covered seat where she'd sat beside Viktor, hidden behind a carved screen while the court orchestra rehearsed a slow mazurka. He hadn't spoken during the music. He'd only leaned forward slightly, one hand resting against the edge of the balustrade, his profile still as the light from the sconces painted gold against his cheek. The silence between them had been full, not empty. Now, in this narrow hallway that smelled faintly of rosin and old varnish, she paused to gather her thoughts before returning to her designated quarters. A quiet step behind her made her turn. "You left before I could ask," Viktor said, his voice low, coat buttoned high against the chill. I didn't want anyone to see us leave together, she replied. There were 2 court stewards by the stairwell. He nodded, then glanced up at the high window, where moonlight edged the frost. They'll notice you soon enough, no matter how careful we are. I know. He studied her, not as a ruler studies a subject, but as someone trying to understand what might bruise or lift the other. The silence between them now held something fragile. You're not afraid, he said. No, she answered. But I'm not foolish either. I didn't expect you to be. She stepped closer, her hands still tucked into the folds of her cloak. What did you want to ask? He hesitated, then reached into his coat and drew out a folded sheet. Not official parchment linen paper, thick, with a faint scent of lavender and ash. He handed it to her. It's a petition. Drafted by Minister Hofleitner. He says we can present it next month under the guise of expanding court appointments to skilled artisans, elevating one to lady-in-waiting. A seamstress, elevated not by birth, but by imperial favor. Zosia held the paper without unfolding it. And if they refuse? They won't. Not if I frame it as part of the empire's modernization. Merit over lineage. It's just enough truth to pass. She looked up at him. And if they accept? Then you'll be assigned quarters near the imperial apartments. You'll have a public title, a stipend, and a place in the formal register. And after that? He stepped close enough that she could see the thin line of fatigue beneath his eyes. After that, we wait until the summer sessions. I'll introduce new succession language, provisions for unions outside traditional dynastic lines if sanctioned by the crown and approved by Privy Seal. It's slow. But it's real. Zosia's fingers tightened around the paper. You're dismantling centuries. I'm reweaving them. She looked down at the document again. Do you know what they'll call me? Ambitious. Dangerous. Unworthy. And you? Unfit. Reckless. In love. She blinked once, slowly, and something inside her settled like a needle finding the right thread. There's a risk, she said. There's always a risk, he replied. But I'd rather risk with you than rule without you. She didn't answer. Instead, she reached for his hand and placed the folded petition between their palms. Then we start here. He closed his fingers over hers and nodded once. They parted before the hour turned. She returned to her assigned chamber without a guard, her footsteps muffled against the woven runner. The room was modest, a fire, a writing desk, a single bed with a carved headboard. A bolt of indigo velvet lay across the seat by the window, untouched since that morning. She sat at the desk and opened the inkwell. The page before her remained blank for a long while. Then she began to sketch. Not a gown. Not trim or hemline. But a banner, a design that wove together the antlers of a Galician stag with the double-headed eagle of the empire, interlaced with thread patterns drawn from the embroidery of the border provinces. A symbol not of rebellion, but of restoration. She would not rise by hiding. She would rise by making herself visible and essential. The next morning, she delivered the sketch to Viktor's private steward, tucked inside her work portfolio. By the time the petition passed through the hands of the council, her name had already begun to circulate in court salons. Not as gossip, but as curiosity. At a formal dinner held 3 nights later, she stood beside the Empress Dowager as lacework she'd sewn herself adorned the silver-blue tablecloth. The Empress's fingers lingered over the border. My mother taught me that pattern, Zosia said quietly. The older woman nodded. I recognized the stitch. It was once used in mourning. Zosia met her gaze. And in survival. The Empress Dowager didn't smile. But she set her wine glass down with care and said, then it belongs here. From across the room, Viktor watched the exchange unfold. He didn't interrupt. He only raised his glass slightly when Zosia looked his way. She didn't return the gesture. She didn't need to. She belonged now. Not because he placed her there, but because she had sewn herself into the fabric of the court thread by thread, stitch by stitch, without apology or concealment. And the tapestry was only beginning. The morning air carried a scent of thawing iron and smoke as Zosia stepped into the vaulted corridor that linked the Hofburg's east wing to the Imperial Council chamber. A footman had delivered a summons before dawn, written in Viktor's hand, though unsigned, and sealed with a wax emblem she had not seen before, a needle crossing a laurel branch. She moved without escort now. The guards at each threshold inclined their heads, not out of habit, but recognition. Behind her, the sound of her boots on the parquet floor matched the rhythm of her breath, measured, unwavering. Inside the chamber, Viktor stood by the long table, flanked by 2 senior ministers. The air was thick with the scent of tobacco and ink. A single chair had been drawn out, set apart from the others. "This is she?" asked the man to Viktor's right, his voice dry as vellum. "Yes," Viktor said. The man turned to Zosia. "You submitted the design for the new civic regalia?" She met his eyes. "I did." He studied her as if parsing a ledger. "And you stitched the ceremonial canopy for the joint audience with the Serbian emissary?" Zosia nodded. "I drafted the pattern and completed the embroidery with 2 assistants." "You were not trained in heraldry." "No," she said. "But I can read, and I know what symbols mean across languages. The double fern for Galicia. The twin lines of braid for unity of crown and province. The angle of the eagle's wing for sovereignty without aggression." The minister's lips pressed together, unreadable. Viktor stepped forward. "She has done more than stitch. She's translated the empire's intentions into visible truth." The second minister, broader shouldered and younger than the first, cleared his throat. "Intentions change. Truth is fixed." Zosia's gaze didn't waver. "Then let the thread reflect what we want to become, not what we were." The elder of the 2 stroked the edge of the table. "You are not here to be questioned further. You've been appointed to the new advisory board on cultural integration. You'll serve alongside the court archivist and the education deputy. You'll be expected to travel." Zosia blinked, once. "Where?" "Bosnia. Lviv, Trieste. Wherever symbols are needed to bind what treaties alone cannot." A pause settled like snowfall. "I accept," she said. Viktor didn't smile. He only inclined his head slightly, a signal, not a gesture of affection. "Not here." After the ministers departed, he lingered by the window, hands clasped behind his back. "You knew they'd test me." "They had to," he replied. "But you gave them no excuse to dismiss you." She stepped beside him. "Trieste," she said softly. "That's far. Farther than we've ever been apart. The journey will take weeks." "Yes." She folded her arms carefully, not in defiance, but to hold something steady. "And when I return? The committee will report their findings to the Crown. And I will announce the formation of a permanent office under the royal studio." She turned toward him. "With me at its head? With you as founder." The wind shifted outside, pulling sunlight across the floor in a slow sweep. "You're building something," she said. "We are." She touched the windowpane. "And when the court asks why I've been given a role no seamstress has held before, I'll tell them the truth." She turned. "Which is? That you saw the empire not as it was, but as it could be. And you didn't wait for permission to begin." That night, she left for Trieste by train, her satchel packed with sketches and a letter from the Empress Dowager, folded and sealed with a pressed bloom from the palace garden. Viktor stood on the platform until the last carriage faded from view, his hands still gloveless despite the cold. In her compartment, Zosia unrolled a narrow strip of silk and began to embroider the first stitches of a border design she hadn't drafted yet. She didn't need to. The form would come with the land, the people, the faces she hadn't seen. She was no longer an orphan with a needle. She was a bridge being built in thread. And she would return. Not as a visitor but as part of the empire's design.